Okay, so you're a startup in India. You've got this brilliant idea, but then comes the hard part, right? Protecting it,
Absolutely. Getting that intellectual property, sorted patents, trademarks, you name it, it costs money. And for early stage companies, well, that's a big deal.
which is exactly why this Startup Intellectual Property Protection Scheme, SIPP, came about,
Hmm.
to try and ease that burden.
Right. The core idea was basically the government helps pay for IP professionals, these approved facilitators, to help startups file everything, make it more affordable.
So today we're diving into how that's actually worked out. We've got briefing docs, articles, a Q&A. We want to see if SIPP hit the mark and, interestingly, look at a proposed alternative.
Yeah, because the initial feedback, or rather what the sources suggest, is that while SIPP seemed good on paper, maybe even boost filings initially, its focus on subsidizing those first filing costs using these sort of artificially low fees, well, it's caused some problems down the line.
Okay, let's unpack that. But first, just remind us, why was SIPP seen as necessary? What was the specific problem it aimed to solve?
It really boils down to the cost versus the need. IP rights are, super important for startups. They protect your innovation, they attract investors.
They give you an edge?
Exactly. But hiring the lawyers, the technical experts, navigating patent law or trademark rules, it's complex and it's expensive, especially when you're just starting out running lean.
Yeah, it's that catch-22. You need the IP to grow, maybe get funding, but paying for the IP itself could sink you early on.
Precisely. So SIPP was meant to be that helping hand, the government stepping in to say, look, we'll cover some of these professional fees.
Connect startups with these certified facilitators who do the work for less because the government was kicking in some cash.
That was the plan. Level the playing field a bit so good ideas didn't just wither on the vine because of filing costs.
Makes total sense. Good intentions, clearly. But like you said, challenges emerged. What were the main cracks that started showing?
Well, one of the big ones flagged in the sources is just the limited reach and impact.
Meaning?
Meaning, yeah, filings went up a bit initially, but the overall number of startups using SIPP, it's described as minuscule compared to how huge the Indian startup scene actually is.
So a lot of companies just weren't benefiting, or maybe weren't even applying for IP.
It suggests that, yeah, which leads to the why. And a major factor seems to be a lack of enthusiasm from the IP professionals themselves.
Okay. Why weren't they enthusiastic?
It links back to what the sources call artificial price controls. The fees the government paid these facilitators were, frankly, much lower than standard market rates.
Yeah.
There's a quote here. It says, "The amount of money paid to facilitators is much less than what they usually charge. Because of this, many experienced IP professionals choose not to participate and lack enthusiasm to market their services to startups."
Okay, that clicks.
Yeah.
If you're a top-tier expert, why sign up for a program that pays significantly less and might involve extra government paperwork? You'd probably just stick with clients who pay your normal rate.
Exactly. You're sort of disincentivizing the very people you need to make the scheme work well.
Right. It's trying to save money, but maybe shooting itself in the foot.
And it gets worse. On top of the low fees, there was another big issue: delayed payments to facilitators.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the sources say payments were often held up for months. Imagine doing the work at a reduced rate already and then waiting ages to get paid.
That's not sustainable.
Definitely not. Another quote highlights this: "The payments are often delayed by many months. This makes the scheme even less attractive for good professionals and could lead to a drop in service quality."
You can see how that would happen. Low pay plus slow pay. It's a recipe for discouraging the best professionals, or maybe even tempting corner cutting from those who do participate.
Precisely. So you've got limited reach, professionals aren't keen, and then there's another layer.
What's that?
The definition of startup eligible for SIPP became, well, quite broad.
How broad?
It eventually included companies with annual turnover up to 100 crores, which is what, over 12 million US dollars?
Wow, okay. A company making that much. You could argue they probably can afford market rates for IP services, right?
That's exactly the concern raised. Is government money, taxpayer money meant for really struggling early stage startups actually going to companies that are already quite established and could likely pay their own way?
So it might not be targeting the support where it's most desperately needed anymore?
That's the question, yeah. Is it still fulfilling its original purpose effectively?
Okay, so SIPP has these clear challenges. Low uptake, unenthusiastic experts due to low and slow pay, and maybe helping companies that don't strictly need the help anymore. So what about this alternative idea?
Right. The alternative shifts the focus completely. Instead of subsidizing the initial filing costs,
Hmm.
the proposal is for the government to help with the long-term cost of maintaining patents, specifically by reducing the annual renewal fees.
Oh, the renewal fees. Okay, explain that. Why is that potentially better?
Well, getting a patent isn't just a one-off thing. You have to pay fees every year or so to keep it active for its whole life, potentially 20 years.
Right, I forgot about those.
And over 20 years, those fees really add up. They can become a serious financial weight for a startup, especially one that's maybe still growing or hasn't fully commercialized the patent yet.
So cutting those fees could offer more sustained help.
That's the argument. As one source puts it, if the government reduced these renewal fees for DPIIT recognized startups, it could offer real long-term financial benefit. DPIIT being the department that officially recognizes startups in India.
Okay, I see the logic. The initial filing fee is a hurdle, sure. But these ongoing costs could force a startup to later abandon a patent they really value just because they can't afford the upkeep.
Exactly. And this alternative seems to have a few advantages over the SIPP model.
Like what?
Well, first, it offers a direct and ongoing benefit. It's not just help at the very start, it's support year after year, potentially for decades.
Sustained help, not just a quick fix. Got it. What else?
A big one. No payment delays, or at least none involving the government in the initial filing process. Because under this model, the startup would just hire an IP professional directly for the initial filing, presumably paying market rates. The government's role comes later with reducing those renewal fees, which are paid directly to the patent office anyway.
Ah, so it cuts out that whole messy facilitator payment system that caused delays. The government isn't the middleman for the initial service payment.
Precisely. It simplifies that part enormously.
Okay, that sounds cleaner. What about the professionals? Would they be more willing to engage?
That's the hope. It could foster true market competition and enthusiasm because there are no artificial price caps set by the government for the initial work.
The experienced professionals have no reason not to work with startups, assuming the startup can pay a fair rate.
Right, and competition between those professionals should, in theory, keep the rates reasonable anyway. The source suggests since there will be no artificial price controls, more professionals will be enthusiastic, and market competition itself will keep their rates competitive.
So let the market handle the initial filing costs, basically.
More or less. And another potential benefit is that lowering renewal costs encourages long-term innovation.
How does that work?
If it's cheaper to keep your patent alive, you're more likely to maintain it, maybe find ways to license it or build on it, rather than letting it lapse just because of the cost. It incentivizes holding onto and using your IP.
Makes sense. Keep the innovation pipeline flowing for longer. And what about the government's budget?
Well, the argument there is for a smarter use of government funds. The money saved by not running the SIPP facilitator subsidy program
Which sounds like it wasn't working that well anyway.
could potentially be redirected, maybe towards boosting R&D funding or strengthening how IP rights are actually enforced, or building better general infrastructure for innovators. More strategic uses, perhaps.
So shift the support from a clunky upfront subsidy to a simpler long-term maintenance relief, and maybe use the saved cash for other innovation-boosting activities.
That's the core idea being proposed, yes. It acknowledges SIPP's good intentions but points to significant practical issues.
And suggests this renewal fee reduction might be, as the source says, a better, more sustainable way to support innovation.
It lets the market figure out the initial filing part, while the government provides that crucial long-term breathing room on maintenance costs.
It really highlights how important it is to not just launch a policy, but to constantly check if it's working as intended, right?
Absolutely. Policies aren't static. The startup world changes so fast. You need to evaluate, listen to feedback from the startups, from the IP professionals.
And be willing to adapt or even pivot if something isn't delivering.
Definitely. As India's ecosystem grows, that regular evaluation is key. And just to be clear, the source author, Aditya Kochar, who is an IP consultant, makes it plain these are his views and advises anyone to get specific professional advice before acting on this.
Good point. Always consult the experts for your specific situation. So wrapping this up, we've seen SIPP started with a solid goal: help startups protect their ideas.
But ran into hurdles, facilitator pay, delays, maybe the scope got too wide.
And this alternative, focusing on reducing those long-term patent renewal fees, seems to offer a potentially smoother, more sustainable path.
It shifts the support model, letting the market handle the initial bit while providing ongoing relief.
Which leaves us with a really interesting final thought. What kind of support really helps a startup succeed with its IP? Is it just about getting that first patent filed?
Or is it more about creating an environment where they can afford to maintain that protection, leverage it, and actually benefit from it over the long haul? Short-term fix versus long-term foundation, maybe.
Yeah,
Two.
something to really chew on. How do you best empower innovation, not just to start, but to last?